Hello, it's me, Beth Rigby from the Electoral Dysfunction podcast, and I wanted to let you know that we are going on tour. We're coming to London, Salford, Liverpool and Glasgow. Ruth Davidson will, of course, be there too.
We're going to have some very special guests, and we're also getting you involved, so come along, ask us any question you like. It is going to be a super fun evening.
For all the info, go to aegpresents.co.uk. We'll be podding in person. Come along.
No one saw it coming, least of all Vladimir Putin. Over the past week or so, thousands of Ukrainian troops have headed into Russia itself. The first time in 80-odd years that foreign forces have done so. Pretty embarrassing, you'd have to think, for the Russian Premier, as he's always said it's the sort of thing that would have him reaching for the red button. I am pleased to say that so far so good in that regard. Armageddon hasn't happened. But President Zelensky's forces have kicked tens of thousands of Russians out of their homes. President Putin, well, he can't be happy. So, what is Zelensky up to? Welcome to the Sky News Daily. I'm Niall Paterson. Well, later we will find out how the incursion is being viewed both in Kyiv and the Kremlin, but we'll start with Sky security and defence analyst Michael Clarke. Michael, I mean, the Ukrainians' main focus appears to be the Kursk region, a part of the world with which I am not desperately familiar. So can you tell me a bit about it?
A medieval city, goes back a long way, more than 1,000 years old. For most people, when they think about Kursk in the Second World War. Yeah. It was the site of the biggest single battle anywhere in the Second World War. So it has enormous resonance for Russians because it represents the Second World War. And the Kursk Oblast, the region, it's a border region with Ukraine. It's relatively industrial, but there's a fair amount of agriculture as well. And a lot of food production, food processing. It's an important rail hub. It was like the West Midlands, if you like, of the Russian Federation.
Yeah. So what has actually been happening there? You and I are speaking at lunchtime on Tuesday, Mike, on what we're on day 7, day 8 of this.
Day 8, eighth day.
We're talking about a fairly substantial amount of territory. I mean, I've seen estimates 1,000 square kilometres. Yeah. A number of different areas have been taken. So how many Ukrainian troops have actually crossed the border into Russia, do we know?
We know there's at least 3 full brigades there, 2 mechanised brigades and an air assault brigade, and elements of all other brigades. So we know there's the equivalent of at least 4 brigades. It's minimum 6,000. It may be up to 10,000. And interestingly, and this is a real telltale sign, they are rotating. Troops in an offensive operation, they only do it for 48 hours, 72 hours, because you can't do it for very long. No. Because you don't get any sleep, and you're fighting all the time, you're under pressure. So after about 48 hours or so, you've got to come out. You've just got to have a rest. And there's quite a lot of evidence of Ukrainian troops rotating in and out, and that shows that they're really rather well organised and quite well supplied with troops who can take the role of these frontline units after 48 hours, 72 hours.
All of which suggests that this was rather well planned by Vladimir Zelensky's military leaders. One has to say, though, I mean, I don't know if this is a term that military analysts like yourselves use often, but it's pretty damn ballsy by Zelensky, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I mean, this is a classic counterpunch. But the risks you take in a counterpunch is that, A, the counterpunch may fail, and B, the amount of forces you've got to put into the counterpunch means that you can't use them somewhere else where you may need them. And that's what the Ukrainians are doing. They're using forces they really do need in the Donbass, and they're committing them to create this pocket in Kursk. If it works, it'll be brilliant. If it doesn't work, it may leave them in a much worse situation ultimately.
And look, there is clearly a PR coup that has been achieved by Vladimir Zelensky. I've seen pictures of Ukrainian troops scaling the side of one of the Russian administrative buildings and pulling down the flags. And that stuff plays incredibly well, I suspect, back home in Ukraine. But is this purely about that PR moment, giving a little bit of a morale boost to those at home? Or is it to try and divert the Russians from other aspects of the conflict, from other places in the war?
In reality, it's both. And so, yes, it's reversing the narrative. I mean, it's giving the Ukrainians something to feel encouraged by, because, the last year they've had nothing but bad news.
Dire, hasn't it?
Absolutely. It changed the narrative in the Western world, and so it shows the Western backers of Ukraine that they really are capable, that they can use this equipment that they've got. And, of course, it has that effect in Russia because, as of today, it looks as if the Russians have evacuated about 180,000 people from the 3 oblasts, from Kursk, from Bryansk and Belgorod. So politically it's having an effect. Militarily, the Ukrainians don't yet know if it's having the effect of pulling big Russian units away from the Donbass, which is what they really, I'm sure, want to do. They so far...
Why do they want that?
Because they're under so much pressure in the Donbass.
Right, just as simple as that, yeah.
Exactly. I mean, they're losing territory on a daily basis further south in the Donbass, and that was the narrative until last week.
And they're still advancing.
They are, yeah, they're still moving. They're moving northwest and southeast. They're probing outwards. We're not sure how far they want to go, and the further they go, of course, the more risk they take, and the more troops they're going to have to reinforce by. So, this process of enlargement must come to an end, but it hasn't yet. On the 8th day, they're still enlarging.
I do wonder, because, of course, Vladimir Putin has spoken many, many times about his red lines, the warnings that he has issued to NATO countries about supplying munitions to Ukraine. I mean, do we know for a fact, first and foremost, that there have been weapons provided by the West that are being used on the Russian side of that border? And if so, might that be something we should be a little bit worried about?
Well, I think a lot of Western politicians, they say they're relaxed about it, but actually they're queasy. I mean, what we can confirm visually from geolocated footage is that, yes, American Stryker armoured vehicles are in this attack. German Marder infantry armoured vehicles are in the attack. American Bradley M2 vehicles, that's the star of the battlefield, the Bradley M2. It's like the Warrior fighting vehicle. It's very, very effective. And they're in the attack. Undoubtedly, a fair bit of Western equipment is involved in this. And that's another threshold crossed. The West is queasy, but the fact is, if we are backing Ukraine to fight this war, in a way, we've got to allow them to fight it in their own way. And, let's be clear, the Ukrainians have no ambition in conquering Russia. Their ambition is to create a tactical situation which is so intolerable to Putin that he has to take forces from elsewhere to deal with it. That's what it's all about.
But isn't there an old phrase, I can't remember what it is, it's something along the lines of don't poke the bear?
Yeah, there is that phrase, but I mean, the bear has been well and truly poked, and it's doing its worst as things are. People say, well, Putin might react. Well, he's already reacting as harshly as he can within Ukraine. They are leaning on Ukraine as hard as they can. They're trying to frighten the West as much as they can. They may increase the level of air attack on Ukraine even more indiscriminately. The things that they would have done over a long period in the winter, they might now try to do in the next 2 to 3 weeks to really retaliate and hurt the Ukrainians, make them realise that these things have consequences. But they're not in principle different to anything they've been doing already. They're doing their worst.
Michael, thanks very much indeed. After the break, we'll have the reaction in Russia to the invasion and what it all means for Vladimir Putin. Back in a sec. Welcome back. We are continuing to talk about Ukraine's invasion of Russia, albeit somewhat limited. Peter Dickinson is editor of the Atlantic Council's UkraineAlert blog and joins us from Kyiv. Peter, you've got to imagine that all of this will play incredibly well for Volodymyr Zelensky.
There's been very little to cheer, very little positive news for almost a year now. There are sporadic successes, but essentially it's been a process of Ukraine just defending and gradually ceding ground and constantly suffering losses. You've got the energy network being partially destroyed by Russian bombardment, blackouts across the country. It's a pretty bleak picture in general. And now all of a sudden, out of the blue, as it were, you have this very dramatic, very bold offensive into Russia. And it really has captured the imagination of the people and provided a very significant morale boost.
When you say out of the blue, were there no indications to ordinary Ukrainians that this was coming? Had Zelensky hinted at it at all?
Really none. I mean, everyone I speak to in the analytical community, in the military community, and politics as well, nobody was really speculating that this was a possibility. Of course, there were fears that Russia would launch an offensive of their own in that region, as they had done relatively nearby in Kharkiv, also in the north of Ukraine in May. So there was speculation that we may see activity in the border zone, but the idea that Ukraine could launch a major operation, a genuine invasion, was really not something that I had discussed. According to the reports that we're seeing, they literally didn't tell anybody. They kept it to a very, very small circle. And even the soldiers and the officers involved were only informed within hours or days before the operation began that this was going to take place.
Yeah, remarkable in this day and age that an operation of this scale could remain so secretive. How is it being sold publicly by Volodymyr Zelensky?
Well, so far they're very tight-lipped. They've said very, very little. Zelensky himself has talked in general terms about bringing the war back to Russia, holding Russia accountable. We've not heard any definitive explanation of what Ukraine is hoping to achieve, and perhaps we shouldn't expect to.
But wasn't part of the reason for the Ukrainian reticence to breach that border and take the fight to Russian territory? Simply put, Vladimir Putin says, you do that, I will use nuclear weapons.
I think Putin's nuclear threats are much more effective in the West than they are in Ukraine. Putin, very famously at the beginning of the war, he began using nuclear threats almost since day one. When he annexed Ukrainian territory in September 2022, he said, I will use nuclear weapons to defend these territories. And he specifically said, I'm not bluffing. Ukraine liberated the city of Kherson, the biggest city in those territories. Weeks later, Putin retreated. With the Black Sea Fleet, we saw the same picture. Putin threatening to defend Crimea, threatening to defend his fleet with nuclear weapons. Ukraine sank or disabled around a third of the fleet. The rest has been forced to retreat. There's been no nuclear consequences. So again and again, we're seeing this pattern. And the invasion of Russia, which we're seeing now by Ukrainian conventional military forces, is basically the biggest red line of all. And so if Russia was serious about these nuclear threats, this would be the moment for them to make good on those threats. And they've not done so. And so they do look very, very empty threats at this point.
Yeah, they certainly do. And Peter, you're using the word invasion. I'm using the word invasion. The one person who's not using the word invasion is Vladimir Putin. And presumably that is entirely because the Russian body politic, the Russian public, do not like to see their territory being ceded to anyone else.
I mean, no country likes to be invaded, it goes without saying. But in the Russian psyche in particular, they do have a very deeply ingrained sort of siege mentality going back to the Mongol era. And then you have a series of invasions that kind of define how Russia sees itself. Certainly Napoleon, certainly World War II and Adolf Hitler. These are things that are absolutely central to Russia's sense of self. It's our sense of identity. So the idea that Russia is once again being invaded, and the fact that it's being done by Ukraine, a country which frankly Russia has deep contempt for, it is a very wounding blow, and it's hugely embarrassing for Putin personally.
But I've seen plenty of reports suggesting that Russian state media has been directed to downplay that which we are seeing in and around the Kursk region.
Yes, I mean, the Russian media is very closely controlled by the Kremlin, and they know how to play the game. They're all very well seasoned propagandists, as it were. Yeah, it does seem from reports that we've seen in the small but still existing independent Russian media leaks that they've been told, we are to downplay this. Russian officials have also been told, don't talk about this, don't make any public statements. The goal is to maintain a sense of calm, almost an illusion of calm at this point. We're talking about significant amounts of Russian territory now under Ukrainian control, more than 100,000 at least refugees now fleeing the expanding conflict zone. We don't know how many Russians have been taken prisoner, but it looks to be quite a significant number based on the available open source evidence. So this is a major operation that we're witnessing unfold. And yet Russia at this point is still kind of in denial, saying don't talk about it, don't cause any panic.
To what extent then, Peter, do you think that Vladimir Putin has been weakened as a leader?
Make no mistake, this is a very significant personal humiliation for Putin. He knows that, and he knows he must respond strongly. What that will be exactly is not quite clear at this point. One would assume that we're going to see very significant missile attacks on Ukrainian cities, on Ukrainian infrastructure. But we've seen that before. We're already seeing that. So we're talking about perhaps an escalation in the air war. He's already launched, as far as most estimates are concerned, the vast majority of the Russian army is already fighting in Ukraine. So the areas for escalation are not clear. The two big escalatory options which have always been on the table and which Putin himself has often used as threats are to broaden the war geographically to other countries, to Ukraine's NATO partners, or the use of nuclear weapons. Now, quite frankly, neither of those options looks likely at this point, but of course, neither can be ruled out.
How long then, Peter, do you think it will be before we see Vladimir Putin doing what he has done in the past and blaming those who are in charge of this military operation?
Well, certainly what we're seeing in the first week of this invasion is that Putin has handed control of this to security services away from the military. Which may be a technicality, but it may indicate loss of faith in the military. He's also now reportedly appointed one of Russia's regional governors, who's actually Putin's former bodyguard, to oversee the operation, which again suggests that he does not have faith in his generals. Now, this is a problem that all dictators face. When they're struggling or when they're weakened, they're always very, very paranoid about potential opposition from within. Putin has cleared out the political scene in Russia. There's no political opposition in Russia still surviving. But any opposition that could come to him, the most likely source would be the military. So I think at this point, he'd be very reluctant to give the military increased powers, and he may actually look to shake things up again and move some commands around and remove some people in order to perhaps get better results in the counterattack in Kursk, but also to protect his own position.
But even given all of that, Peter, there is a risk here, isn't there, that Vladimir Zelensky has perhaps overstretched himself. If this invasion has shone a light on anything, it is perhaps the fact that the West should right now be considering the tempo of the transfer of arms and materiel to Ukraine right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the Western military aid to Ukraine has been significant, but we shouldn't overestimate it. I think if you look at the overall amount of military capabilities of the West and the supplies that they have at hand, they've actually provided very little to Ukraine. And one of the main reasons there is this fear of escalation, this excessive sense of caution. I think Ukraine has now demonstrated, again, by crossing this reddest of red lines, by invading Russia and not provoking a major escalation. They've shown that the West has actually nothing to fear, and it shouldn't be so cautious. On the contrary, if they want this war to end, the answer is not to step cautiously and seek to avoid provoking Putin, to seek to somehow appease him. The answer is to go in strong, because ultimately the only thing that Putin understands is the language of strength. And so far, the West has been very reluctant to speak to him in that language. I think that has to change if we're going to see an end to this war. And Ukraine is trying to show the way here with this very bold invasion.
Has this incursion re-inspired hopes amongst the Ukrainian people and amongst the analysts like yourselves that victory in this conflict is possible for the Ukrainians? Or are we just stringing this all out until we finally get the key players sitting around at the negotiating table?
They've already taken more land in a week than Russia's managed to take in Ukraine so far this year, I believe. So it's a significant amount of territory. If they're able to take and hold more, of course, that opens up room for some negotiations later on down the road. And there's no doubt, whatever Putin may say now, there's no question in my mind that he would be obliged to enter into negotiations if Russian land is at stake, because that is a huge symbolic blow and a huge humiliation for him. He has to first and foremost protect Russian land. But I think the main thing that we're seeing now is, A, that Russian red lines are not set in stone. They can be crossed, and the West shouldn't be afraid of that. It does give you a sense that there's a lot more to this war, there's a lot more that can happen, but it's still very early days.
That's your lot for today. Back again tomorrow.